I wanted to ask you, Ross Garnaut, arising from what Robert Hill was saying, that about China's apparent emerging commitment to alternative energy. Our correspondent Stephen McDonald's actually as it happens, done a story about it for us that will be on the programme tonight. They are investing billions. They have huge wind farms. They're investing billions in solar. And in fact, there's a famous story of an Australian-Chinese professor who went back there because he found that he wasn't finding it so easy here and became, I think, the 5th richest man in China on the back of building solar power plants. Is that going to make a real dent? Is it a serious contribution?
Yes, what's happening in China is very important to a solution. I'd like to pick up related questions that both Robert
Please,
and
let's begin a conversation.
Raised. But just on the China issue, China for some time has recognised that there is a global warming problem, and they are part of the problem, and that they will have to be part of the solution. And you get that far. I've been getting that far in conversations with ministers in China for 18 years. And then the question becomes, what is a fair solution, a fair contribution? And that's where some progress is being made. As in America, there's anxiety about the supply of petroleum in particular, and so there's some pressure to do things for alternative energy to take pressure off that. So in China and in the United States, there's some confluence of concern for
climate change,
petroleum security and climate change. China's got some big points of vulnerability to climate change, like Australia has, like India has. The three issues that are on their minds, deglaciation of the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau could upset the steadiness of the flows of the great rivers, the Yangtze and the Yellow River, which are very important to historically Chinese civilization today, to Chinese life. They're worried about the warming and drying of the North China Plain and what that's doing for agriculture, in some ways an analogue to concerns we have in southern Australia. They're worried about the vulnerability to relatively small amounts of sea level rise of the great coastal industrial cities which are built on river deltas. Guangzhou, the edges of Shanghai, Ningbo, a number of the coastal cities. So there's a lot of good science in China, and scientists have influence in China. So there's real discussion of China's interest in a global solution, and there's recognition that they're now quite a big part of the problem. They've focused mainly on trying to accelerate introduction of low emissions technology. They've got by far the world's biggest nuclear program, which has both energy security and climate change motivations. They've got by far the world's biggest wind energy program. They've got by far the world's biggest solar energy program. They've got by far the world's biggest biomass energy program. And they're further advanced than other countries on actual applications of carbon capture and storage from coal combustion. But they're doing all of these things, and yet consumption of fossil fuels is growing at one heck of a rate. That's the nature of Chinese
new coal-fired power plant every week?
That's no longer true. It was true up till about 18 months ago. The global financial crisis helped that a little bit. And they've and a lot of China's embarked on by far the largest domestic expenditure expansion programs in response to the global financial crisis, and structural change associated with reduction in energy use and reduction in emissions is a big part in those programs. So some of the recent changes in response to the crisis have been important. China is also recognising that it will be very vulnerable in international trade if the developed countries are all moving to do something and it's not. And that's why they're taking very seriously the initiative from the Obama administration to put an agreement between the US and China at the center of US climate change thinking. From what I hear about the discussions that Robert referred to in the last week in Beijing, yes, there's a lot of noise and a lot of clanging, but I think that there has been significant progress and issues are being identified. It will take a long time to get there, but there are real discussions going on. And China's going to end up responding to those discussions with the United States and to the international discussions by putting on the table something that will be, I think, given all of the circumstances and given its stage of development, a proportionate contribution to a global agreement. India's a little bit harder. India hates being compared with China. It says Chinese greenhouse gas emissions per capita are 4 times ours, which they are. China's a lot further down the path of development. So, talk to us when we're as rich and emitting as much carbon dioxide as China is. And they've got a point, of course, but the other side of the point is that India is so big and it's growing so fast that its contributions to global emissions will be quite substantial unless it is putting in place constraints from now. And you're starting to get a constructive discussion around the Indian Prime Minister of these issues, and will be helped, of course, by the strengthening of Manmohan Singh's government in the recent election. But the discussions there is nowhere as far along the track as in China. Gillian drew attention to the problem of industries in the developed countries or in the countries that are taking action, which I expect to include China, losing out competitively against countries that are not taking action unless you have some recognition of the issue in international trade discussions. I think there's no solution to this that doesn't have all of the major economies, the big developing countries at least, accepting caps on total emissions and being able to trade the difference between those caps and what their actual emissions are. They can be the emissions entitlements can be calculated in different ways for different countries. Can give some headroom for India and Indonesia and other countries, but there does have to be a cap. And once you've got a cap and trade in permits, you end up with a similar carbon price in all countries, or similar cost of dealing with emissions in all countries, and that levels the playing field. That has one incidental advantage. It takes away the rationale for giving out free permits to trade-exposed industries here and in the United States and in Europe and Japan and everywhere else, and that's going to be a big budgetary factor. One legacy of the crisis is going to be dreadful budget problems in all of the developed countries. President Obama has written into his forward budget estimates, as his way of getting the budget back into reasonable shape. Huge revenues from auctioning all of the permits within an emissions trading scheme. Well, that's been compromised by the political discussion, as it's been compromised by the political discussion here. But if we've got a global agreement, trade in emissions entitlements, similar carbon prices in all significant countries, then the rationale for free permits for trade-exposed industries disappears everywhere, and that becomes a major part of Australia's, of America's, of Britain's, of Germany's, of Japan's coming to grips with the post-crisis budget problem.
All right. Well, Robert Hill, you're recently back from the United States. We've been talking a lot about China and India, but obviously the United States is a huge driver in all of this. I know you've been at the United Nations, but you've also obviously been observing the new Obama administration. How do you think that it's going to change things?
Well, I think Obama is a genuine believer and a very determined man. Whether that's going to be sufficient, I think really depends on what they get out of China. And it's very hard to envisage in the end what sort of agreement you can really get. You've got this unusual situation, following on from what Gillian said, of really two streams of negotiation, and one is in some ways not a real negotiation taking place at the moment. The Kyoto stream, well, that there is a structure there, and that could be progressed, except that the US is not going to become a party to it. So you therefore say that that's really, to all real intents, the end of that process. So then you're into the new big challenge, which we mentioned, which is one that includes the major developing countries as well. And how do you turn that into a legally binding agreement when you won't get a commitment out of China in a legally binding form? And how will that then play into the domestic United States politics? That's going to be the challenge for Obama. When China may come up with quite an ambitious voluntary commitment, but whether that's going to be sufficient to meet the political requirements within the United States when it comes to the crunch, I think is quite an issue.
Gillian Triggs, brings us to you and the China's track record in terms of international law.
Before I answer that question, can I just follow up from something Robert was saying? Because I think it's probably worth remembering that one of the reasons the United States did not become a party to Kyoto, despite having gone home from Kyoto with an agreement sort of tucked under its arm and an expectation that it would be part of the process, there had been almost no attempt to bring the Senate along with it. And I think there was this notorious vote of 93-0 in the Senate. It was quite clear that there was no point introducing, the president then being Bill Clinton, introducing a bill into the Senate because it was going to fail and the US stayed out of the Kyoto process. It does seem to me quite interesting that this time we seem to have a situation in which we have all of that enthusiasm and determination of President Obama, but we also have much closer, careful work being done with the Senate to ensure that there is some support in the Senate for what might emerge from Copenhagen. So at least that's a positive sign.
And, well, also to remember that the US went to Kyoto and actually bid up the targets. Gore went on behalf of Clinton and demanded more from the world. And therefore there's a lot of parties to this negotiation who feel quite let down by the United States because they made commitments on the basis of what the then administration committed to. They accepted legally binding targets that they haven't been able to meet, and they accepted economic obligations that they were extraordinarily worried about at the time. And they don't want to get sucked into that again. So I think it is important that this time it's important from the point of view of the global negotiation that Obama is seen to be working more closely with the Congress. But it's also going to be very important from the point of view of whether you get an outcome that can actually be implemented.
That's right. Your very interesting question, China and international law.
Yeah, I was wondering because I know that all kinds of things, down to intellectual property and so forth, it has been very, very difficult for China and the world to get their gear wheels to mesh together.
Well, at a technical level, China has been a real participator in international law and it has ratified most of the major treaties. The real difficulty is for China to implement those treaties in domestic law and to give effect to them. So sort of intellectual property is one very important one where you have a political commitment as a nation to the major Convention and others, but a practical inability to give real effect to it domestically. And up to a point that's been true in relation to human rights law, law of the sea, and so on.
Which is a bit of a paradox for one of the most controlling central governments in the world.
It is very paradoxical, and in fact those who are China experts, Professor Garnaut here can confirm this, but I think it's at the middle level of the bureaucracy where they're having so much trouble actually implementing the ideas of a refreshed leadership, and that's proved to be very difficult. In relation to climate change, however, and this is typical of China's approach to international law generally, China has been very much a traditionalist. It insists on the traditional rules of international law and refuses perhaps to move to a more modern area. For example, it always claimed sovereign immunity from the jurisdiction whenever it can, a classical tradition of international law. But also it's taken full advantage of its technical position as a developing country. So it's always claimed the benefit of being classified in that way. And we really now cannot divide the world into developed and developing countries. It's overly simplistic. And now we're looking at questions of less developed countries and so on. But China will always take advantage of that in explaining why it's unable to give effect to particular provisions in international agreements. And that's no more true than in relation to Kyoto and climate change generally. So it's very, very difficult for China to take the leading role as a politically powerful state, avoiding the rhetoric of developed and developing countries.
All right, I'd like to take some questions from the floor now. While people are getting themselves to the two microphones over there, I'm just going to ask you, any of you who want to comment very briefly on the attempt by Senator Fielding, who is clearly likely to have some kind of pivotal role in all of this, to try and reignite the debate over whether climate change is happening or whether it is man-made. I suppose, Ross, you've been asked this most often. Well, and we'll come to questions.
These sorts of things happen in a democracy, but it's very embarrassing and very sad.
Robert Hill?
Oh, I don't knock a debate, but the vast majority of climate change scientists believe that we are significantly contributing to a problem that needs to be addressed, and that's where that's the overwhelming position. And there will be, you will never get all scientists to agree on anything, and if he wants to tag onto that and to contribute to that debate, that's his entitlement. I'm not too fussed by that.
Unless you want to jump in, Gillian.
The Australian newspaper seems to be encouraging it.
Indeed.
Good morning. Hi. My name is Mariah Foley. I'm a reporter with the International Herald Tribune and a new research student at the University of Sydney. Given that a lot of the discussion so far on the international stage has been around emissions targets, which arguably have not been successful given the unwillingness of the US and China to sign on, and the dispute between the developed and the developing world over what are fair targets, I'm wondering if there's any merit to the idea that now proportionally more discussion could take place around the idea of developing a new framework that would invest more in renewables, the research, the development, the gearing up the renewables to replace fossil fuels, make them more viable, both for the developed world and the developing world.
Yes. Unfortunately, something that focuses on development of the new technologies won't be enough. And because of the diabolical nature of the international problem, there's not going to be a solution without an international agreement.
Ross, sorry to interrupt. Do you mean it won't be enough, or it won't be enough in the short term?
It won't be enough because unless you're putting a price on carbon, you rule out progress in a whole lot of areas. For example, there's no way, no matter how much and how good the research, development and commercialisation of carbon sequestration technologies, there's no way in which a carbon capture and storage is going to be cheaper than just putting the exhaust into the air, which we've done since the beginning of industrialisation. So you need the carbon price and the technological support if you're going to get a solution. And coal's a big issue in this, and so to adopt an approach that rules out progress on coal, or big progress through carbon capture and storage, is a big setback. And because anything you do that makes big progress has short-term costs, considerable short-term costs for the countries that are doing it. I've estimated those in a fair bit of detail through my joint modelling with the Treasury. That's all in my report. You're not going to get each country doing enough unless there's an international agreement. So there does need to be much more investment in research, development and commercialisation of the new technologies. There does need to be an international agreement on all developed countries increasing their efforts in that area, but that alone won't get us there.
Either of you? Gillian?
But I was going to say, but it is an important component, and it's a question of what comes first. And to get to a sort of a global cap and trade system that Ross is talking about is extraordinarily difficult. But there's a lot that can be done in the meantime in the development of alternative energies, and the more that's done will reduce the cost and it'll gradually become more competitive. There's a lot more that can be done in conservation of energy, huge opportunities in energy efficiency, which is an area that President Obama is putting great emphasis, and the development of alternative energies is another part of it. So to be encouraging investment in that area in the meantime, I think is a very important thing.
Well, in fact, the United Nations reported last year that for the first time ever there was a greater investment in renewable energy than there was in the traditional energy forms. So I think we can see a very major shift in this without necessarily reaching formal legal agreements. In other words, we're creating a culture and an economic environment in which investment in renewals is important. I think it's a very important question for Australia, obviously, and in particular the question of nuclear energy and Australia's role as a major supplier of yellow cake and possibly ultimately managing the waste. These are public questions that I think we need to be airing now in the context of renewables.